Welcome to Yesterday Airlines. In this video we're going to take a look at my Eastern Airlines fleet, which, as with all the other major US trunk carriers, lives in this large glass display cabinet. So let's begin. The majority of my Eastern fleet resides on one of the lower shelves down here. It's not the entire thing, I can't fit all of them on, and Eastern has been blessed, and collectors have been blessed by a large number of releases featuring Eastern Airlines aircraft, mostly by Aero Classics. So we really owe AC a debt of gratitude for such a wonderful range of hockey sticks and Golden Falcons and so on. So we'll start as usual over on the left with the oldest aircraft historically, which are the piston propliners. So the piston propliners, these are all Aero Classics. All the models in view are by AC. Over on the far left we've got the oldest historical aircraft, which is this Great Silver Fleet Douglas DC-3. Behind it we've got a slightly updated livery version from the early 50s, and behind that we've got a Douglas DC-4 and an early short body Constellation. Moving into the 50s with the white tops, and we've got a later model Super Constellation. Behind it we've got an early DC-7, and behind that a Convair 440 and a DC-6. The DC-6 is quite a recent release by AC, and it's relatively unusual in that Eastern themselves didn't operate many Douglas DC-6s. They only operated a small number and not for very long. Obviously they were a major Connie operator and a major DC-7 operator, but never really spent a lot of time with the DC-6. Into the beginnings of the jet age, which Eastern approached with some trepidation. Rickenbacker really didn't make large jet orders. He was not convinced. He put a decent amount of effort into the Lockheed L188 Electra, as you can see here, and he ordered a small number of DC-8s, and this is one of the earliest DC-8 schemes, though it's not got quite the earliest titling that was available, which had DC-8B as part of the titles too. Moving into the early 60s, and Eastern had a wide range of colour scheme changes. You can see here on the updated scheme we've got a Convair 440, a DC-7 and a later Electra, probably a post-LEAP Electra. Behind them we've got a Red Spear Super Constellation. Eastern pioneered several innovations in transport, one of which was this concept of an Eastern Airbus, which did last a few years in the 60s. As the name suggests, the idea is to move passengers cheaply. Did okay, wasn't a huge hit. Next to that we've got a freighter converted Super Constellation, and behind those we've got another couple of livery variations for the DC-8s. More suited to Eastern's network was the Boeing 727, but in the meantime Eastern leased a few Boeing 720s, and again this one has the longer Fly Eastern Airlines titles as opposed to the shorter later Fly Eastern titles present on this very early 727. Behind their 727 we've got a bit of an interloper. It's a Macchi International Convair. Now Eastern took over the original Macchi in the 1960s. This Convair actually is from the resurgent Macchi, but nonetheless there aren't any other Macchi aircraft in 400 scale, and the aircraft itself actually used to be an Eastern Convair. Now Eastern's most famous scheme is of course the hockey stick, and initially there were a few variations going around, one of which had the Falcon on the tail, and you can see that is represented here both by an Electra and a Convair 440, but in the end the decision was made to create the hockey stick itself and swing the double cheat line up onto the tail, and you can see that looks beautiful on most aircraft, including these two Electras, one of which has the bicentennial, is it a rosette? I guess it's kind of like a rosette on the forward fuselage. Behind them we've got a late DC-7. Some of these got into the hockey stick, as did some of the Super Constellations. And behind that, an up-engined DC-850 and a Boeing 720s. The 720s really only lasted, I think, perhaps until the very early 70s before they were replaced by more 727s. Easton was an early customer for the DC-9, and here's a DC-930 also wearing the hockey stick scheme, and of course a 727-100, which also has the bicentennial rosette. Now, in terms of larger aircraft, Easton didn't really have a large number of long routes, but nonetheless found some use for stretch DC-8s in the late 60s, though again they didn't last a long time in the fleet. It was the TriStar which was really the aircraft that Easton wanted. It was delayed and it had quite a few service entry niggles, but Easton eventually got the big Tri-Jet working well. This is an NG Models release, and here we've got the older Gemini Jets release, still a nice model. Of course, looming over all of these aircraft in the back are a pair of 747s. Easton didn't take delivery of any 747s for itself, but it did lease several frames from Pan Am. As you can see, this one is wearing a very hybrid Pan Am scheme, and this is a Gemini Jet 747. And over here we've got the Big Bird or Aero Classics version wearing the hockey stick. Once the TriStars were really coming on stream though, the 747s were all dumped and the TriStars took over. Over here we have Easton's break with American producers, which is of course the Airbus A300, an aircraft that Borman took a chance on when he really felt they needed the capacity and there was no other suitable aircraft available, and did Easton proud, and obviously Airbus benefited heavily from the deal as well. Moving forward, we've got a stretch 727-200, and then of course towards the late 70s Easton switched to a bare metal version of the scheme, and here we've got DC-950, a pair of 727s. The one in the front is a much more recent Aero Classics release, and the one in the rear is an older Gemini release. They're both really nice though. And last but not least, a Dragon Wings silver TriStar. And NG haven't been able to, or haven't chosen to, reproduce a bare metal TriStar yet. I'm hoping to see quite a few more NG models Easton TriStars. So that is all of the Easton fleet that fits in this cabinet. That is not the entire Easton fleet. I have a few more Easton aircraft which date from the 1980s, and they are found in the cabinet which is reserved for aircraft from the 80s and 90s and ones that really don't fit anywhere else. So let's move over and have a look at the remainder. Here we are, the 1980s and early 90s portion of the Easton fleet. Obviously the 80s were a torrid time for Easton, as the Frank Lorenzo Texas Air takeover really gutted the airline and caused all kinds of disputes with its employees, which eventually got so bad that the carrier basically collapsed in on itself. So there were lots of variations to the scheme during the 80s. You can see here that on this DC-9 and on the 757s, the cheat line has been lowered to underneath the window line, which saved substantial money when you had to do repaints. We've got a grey-bodied Airbus A300, as the A300s were not suitable for taking on an all-metal look. And we've got an Aero Classics DC-1030 here as well, and the DC-10s were acquired for some longer range international routes to Europe, and eventually ended up, the last of them, operating a few South American routes. There are 4 Easton 757s in my collection here. 2 of them are NG models and 2 of them are Aero Classics. They're all very nice. Obviously 2 of them are wearing the later and the last scheme that Easton ever applied, which got rid of the 757 titles and also had minor differences in terms of the position of the cheat line running onto the nose. You can see that the light blue portion did not move onto the nose in the later scheme, stopped at the cockpit. So that is the later portion of my Eastern fleet. So Eastern is definitely one of the biggest fleets in my model collection, and it is one of my favourite airlines. It's got such a fascinating and interesting history, constantly exciting changes and conflicts going on at Eastern throughout its tenure, and some really nice liveries and some really nice models. What would I like to see more of in 400 scale for Eastern? Obviously, I'd love to see some more TriStars. I'd also be, pretty happy to be seeing some more DC-9s, and I wouldn't mind replacing this Gemini 747, even though it's quite nice. It'll be nicer on an updated mould. But overall, we've got a pretty good selection of aircraft going here for Eastern, and pretty happy with the way the fleet has turned out. So thanks for watching this video. If you've enjoyed it, obviously like it, subscribe to the channel, and check out my website, Yesterday's Airlines, for loads of other information about 400 scale models and aviation history and that kind of stuff. So thanks very much for watching. See you later.